Hello everyone. Now we're going to discuss structural functionalism. It's one of the first units we look at that's completely located in the 20th century in terms of influence, in terms of sociological theory. Structural functionalists are concerned with what we call a meta theory. In other words, they often made close analogies to the physical sciences, and they were looking for a theory that would explain all of social action, all of society, in fact, in terms of what they termed a social system. Now, if we think about the meaning of the word system, it starts to make sense. Sometimes the language is difficult. So let's stop and think about what we mean when we talk about a system. A social system can be the solar system, a banking system, or the human body, a biological system. These all, or an ecosystem sometimes we can talk about. These are all work towards a kind of homeostasis or stability or harmony, or however you might want to term. They all hang together, right? Structural functionalists drew heavily on biological metaphors, and those in organizational theory still do to some degree. But a biological system, think about it for a minute. It's an interrelated parts work together to create stability. Your body, all the parts of the systems within your body that you learned about perhaps in biology and when you were in high school, all function together, so to speak, or they don't function, they dysfunction to some degree. The emphasis that structural functional analysis places is on systems within systems. Again, they use biological metaphors, and a biological metaphor is apt in our understanding just at what they were getting at. We have a nervous system, for example, a digestive system, an endocrine system, a reproductive system, a waste removal system, and so forth. They've got to work in concert with each other. If you pull one away, there's some instability or disequilibrium where the complete system, the biological system, breaks down. So this is the way structural functionalists thought about society. Families, for example, are systems within systems. Structural functionalists thought about systems within systems. So too is the economy, religion, the educational system. This way of thinking in general, this rational orientation towards both individual and collective action, although the emphasis was on how collective action determines individual action, much more so than it was for our earlier discussion in symbolic interaction. Pretty much was a dominant way of thinking about society for most of the mid part of the 20th century, from the 1930s to about 1975 or so. Critics of this school, and they've been vitriolic, which came to dominate sociological thought in the U.S. After the 70s, constituted a backlash against this structural functionalism. Considerations of power and inequality, which really were not addressed, and social change, in fact, were viewed as not addressed in structural functionalism. And there were a lot of attacks against Parsons and a structural functionalist approach in general. Parsons, however, was engaged in a descriptive, not a prescriptive task, and although there were compelling critiques, his view of gender roles as complementary, for example, gives the entire feminist intellectual tradition in the 1970s a solid basis from which to wage a critique. He was not advocating for these systems, merely describing them. For Parsons, human agency was situated in an array of parameters and constraints and conditions that determined action. In other words, our bigger social reality determines individual action. While there might be a reciprocal relationship, Parsons is not emphasizing this. He's emphasizing, he says for the most part, our individual actions are entirely determined and constrained by the social situation in which we find ourselves. So, human agency was situated in this array of parameters and conditions, and it's a deterministic actions. He termed these parameters, the unit act. Units consisted of 4 basic elements. First, they are oriented towards attainment of specific ends or goals. Second, actions take place in situations consisting of the physical and social objects to which the actor must relate. Third, actions are guided and constrained by norms. And fourth, actions require expenditures or effort of energy. For example, think of your life of a student. You are oriented toward a goal, successful completion of a degree. You have to relate to physical and social objects, access to your texts, your professor, me, the web, the desire to learn help desk when you have problems, your advisor, perhaps other students. You're normatively regulated. There are rules for taking tests, discussion posts, following the course schedule. So you're constrained, and in determining your action is determined by all of these elements of the unit act. Parsons also emphasized what he termed pattern variables. 1. Affectivity versus affective neutrality. Affectivity versus affective neutrality. Do you have feelings, or is it good to be emotionally neutral? As a parent, I definitely have feelings, about my son taking certain actions. As a professor, it's best if when confronted by a bad student or colleague, I maintain a sort of emotional distance. Affective neutrality. 2. Self versus collective orientation. A student will major in something that will make her money. That's a self-orientation. Versus having to quit school to support her family. Collective orientation. 3. Universalism versus particularism. You turn your sister into the cops for doing drugs and appeal to universal laws versus ignoring it. A particular orientation towards a relationship you personally have with your sister. 4. Ascription versus achievement. You may have counted this in discussions of stratification in your intro class. You can drink beer because you're 21 and ascribe status, a given attribute, versus earning a bachelor's degree in sociology, an achievement. 5. Specificity versus diffuseness. If I work for McDonald's, I have a very specific task. I'm a grill, front counter, utility, mopping and cleaning, or drive-through. If I'm a college professor, I have diffuse tasks. So that's a couple of Parsons' key concepts. Another theorist important in our discussion of structural functionalism is Robert K. Merton. He held that functions were either manifest, that is, I want to go to college and get a PhD, versus latent, I went to college and found my wife. Lots of people do both, but the latent function, finding a spouse, is not at all the intended function of going to college. So these are a couple of core ideas that I think would be necessary starting off point for you to master these ideas that we see in this unit on structural functionalism. Have a great week.